So thanks everybody, and my own phone off, of course. Good morning everyone, and welcome to our webinar on an evidence-led approach to mapping your cluster with John Hobbs, a senior lecturer in economics with Munster Technological University. V-LINC is a cluster expert research unit led by John, who has a track record in analysing sectors and providing critical evidence for both business and policymakers in support of sectoral economic development. John has supervised MBSs and PhDs focused on industry clustering and is currently supervising PhD candidates in both Belgium and Botswana. John has led an IDA proposal to fund and animate Cyber Ireland, Ireland's national cybersecurity cluster, which has in excess of 180 members across Ireland. And John is a member of the TCI Cluster Evaluation Working Group. John will present today on how V-LINC maps, analyses and visualises supply chains and value chains in clusters for 25 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A. Following this, John will showcase how clusters can build regional resilience and economic competitiveness from an evidence-led approach. With time permitting, Q&A will follow. The ground rules for today. John will present for 25 to 30 minutes before opening up for the Q&A, and at 10:40 we will return to regional resilience followed by a short Q&A. For now, everybody is muted. We encourage you, please submit your questions, comments on the chat. Today's session is being recorded, and without further delay, I'll pass you over to John and we will get started.
So thanks very much, Clodagh, and thanks to Clodagh and Nathan for the invite to present this morning at this webinar. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit, I suppose, about the V-LINC group and what we're doing and how we have developed this methodology to help clusters and policymakers to understand the different clusters and sectors that they have in their regions, how their value chains are connected. And we've been, I suppose, touching on the area of regional resilience recently, and I'll explain that as we move along as well. So delighted to be here this morning. So in terms of the V-LINC research group, we are a research entity based in CIT, what was formerly CIT, now Ireland's latest technological university, the Munster Technological University. We've been at the area of sort of clustering for about 15 years. So we've been looking at what's been happening internationally in that sort of space, how clusters develop, and learning, I suppose, bits and pieces about them, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we'll share some of that with you this morning. So we've been engaged in cluster development more recently with the Cyber Ireland cluster that Clodagh mentioned, and we have developed some cluster training and mentoring activities as well to support organizations. Now, most of that has actually occurred outside of Ireland because Ireland has probably been late to the cluster party, but we'll explain some more of that as we go along. So we've developed this nice system to map, analyze, and evaluate the links and relationships that companies have within clusters. So I'm going to explain all about that later, but not to delve too deep into it at the moment. I suppose it's a little bit different to the other types of mapping that you would see, and I'll give examples of those and further explain the V-LINC analysis later. But it really, I suppose, helps to analyze, visualize your cluster, articulate the strengths, and really promote the sort of links and capabilities and connections that your members have. So we've been fortunate enough that the methodology has actually been endorsed and backed as a good practice by Interreg Europe, and we got a Paper of the Year award at the Harvard Business School microeconomics conference December 2 years ago, the last time they actually met face to face. So it's nice to gain that recognition, I suppose, from the implementation of this type of analysis. So I'm going to go backwards a little bit and just give you, I suppose, my spin on and understanding on what clusters are. So they've become this global policy tool which has been implemented by governments and regional development agencies to encourage competitiveness, innovation, growth, building of trust and capabilities and connections between companies. So in essence, I suppose every region in the world now at this stage is looking to implement this model and to bring back the benefits that you can see there on the the right-hand side of this slide. So, you know, there's a lot of research out there from organizations like the ECCP, who are trying to get to the bottom of, you know, why do clusters matter and advocate further for them. And, you know, there's lots of facts and figures there about the growth, you know, the turnover, how they support startups, higher, you know, wages for the companies that are engaged within clusters, etc. And we have lots of people competing now, I suppose, to become the next Silicon Valley and to develop clusters with some of the rewards that you see on the right-hand side of that slide. So cluster initiatives then are specialized institutions known as cluster organizations that come from various different backgrounds. So they can be non-profit associations, they could be started out of public agencies, so government departments or universities or IoTs, or they could be individual companies. And these cluster organizations sit at the middle of the cluster and help them, I suppose, to facilitate the different connections between the companies. So bring the companies to the table, help them to build trust, share programs, knowledge, etc. And we're very interested, I suppose, in how those cluster organizations have been implemented as a policy tool across Europe and further afield. So you'll hear me mention cluster organizations a lot, and generally when I talk about clusters, I'm really speaking about these organizations that sit at the middle, you know, that help and support the businesses that sit around their ecosystem. So it's also, I suppose, important to look a little bit at what's not a cluster, because there's a lot of confusion, I suppose, with the terminology. But you have things like real estate developments, industrial parks, science or technology parks, you know, startup or innovation support, business incubators, technology centers, research centers, special economic zones, free trade zones, professional or trade industry associations, supply chain networks, export networks, or just a large company that has a lot of suppliers or customers that are based around them. None of those would be a cluster on their own, but they can all be important elements of a cluster that's working and connected and highly engaged with each other. So in terms of cluster organizations, they're all very, very different. They differ by their sector, by their membership, their size, their scale. So, you know, a tourism cluster is very, very different to a cybersecurity cluster, or, you know, an agri-food cluster is very, very different to a biopharma manufacturing cluster, etc. They'll have different types and sizes of companies that will be engaged with them, and they might have a different sort of geographical focus as well. And one of the biggest problems is that we can't recognize a cluster when we see one. So what does an actual cluster look like? And largely, I suppose, to a point that's irrelevant. I suppose what's essential is that they function, collaborate, cooperate, and bring benefits back to their members, that they're personalized to fit their members' needs, and that they don't need to be the next Silicon Valley. They just need to understand their members, build on their collective strengths, and reduce their weaknesses. So this slide is something, I suppose, that we've been discussing a lot within our V-LINC research group. And I suppose that there's four key pillars that we see as critical for clusters. So you have networking and collaboration, you have research and innovation, you have skills development and training, and you have internationalization. And if you think back to the list of those that are not, that wouldn't be considered clusters from a European perspective, some of those organizations would do a lot of what's happening on the left-hand side of the screen. So they do a lot of networking and collaboration, or they might develop some training initiatives for their members, or they might host a skills net or something like that. But they don't often touch what's happening on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the key part, I suppose, in terms of that economic growth piece. It's the building and developing new international connections and value chains. It's that research and innovation that gives you that competitive advantage and allows companies to pop off each other and build new ideas and strategies and look for more markets. So that they're really, I suppose, what we see as the foundations of clusters. And for me, when you're talking about a cluster organization, it's an organization that is doing things for its members in those 4 areas. Okay. So in terms of, I suppose that's a nice intro for what we'll talk about today. And as Clodagh mentioned, I'll give some examples of cluster mapping and value chains, which relate back to the evidence-led approach that we've developed here in MTU. Then we'll take some Q&A, because there's a nice break to the presentation there, and we'll come back and look a little bit more about resilience and how we've started to work in that area through V-LINC as well. So in terms of cluster mapping, we believe, I suppose, visuals give a lot of information to people, and understanding mechanisms like clusters or economic development tools like clusters can be hugely beneficial if you can showcase, what the cluster looks like. And to give you some examples of how that's been done by others over time. So Michael Porter's done a lot of work on clustering, and probably would be the godfather of clustering. So based out of Harvard, he's done a lot of work looking at various different clusters all across the US and now internationally. So one of the types of mapping that he showcases as part of his work is really, a map that highlights the various different segments that operate within a cluster ecosystem. So there are no real company names, or there's no educational institutes that are kind of listed or that are working as part of this, but it's just a diagram of who's connected within that sector. So some of Porter's other work then looks at, so this is the US cluster mapping website, and a lot of that is built and derived from his research group in Harvard, and it collects economic data on wages, on levels of employment, and other factors to look at where are there areas where clusters or sectors of industry have developed. So utilizing, in Ireland, this would be CSO data. So from National Statistics Office, pulling that data together and coming up with these maps that indicate where there are clusters of industry that may or may not be connected together, but that they have large concentrations of these. So another type of map then that you might have seen through various different presentations, or you might have come across the European Cluster Collaboration Platform, and they give a map of various different cluster organizations all across Europe. So you connect with the European Cluster Collaboration Platform, you give them your details and fill out a couple of forms, and that has you connected then on that European Cluster Collaboration Platform. And it's a great tool and resource for reaching out to other clusters that would be based in your sector, to connect with them across Europe, and even some that are further afield. So the types of maps that we've developed are quite different, I suppose, to the 3 that you've seen. So what we want to understand is the relationships between those actors that we had in Porter's first map. So if I go back to the Boston Biopharmaceuticals cluster here, essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand the relationships and connections between the companies and these different institutions within Porter's map there on the left of the Boston Biopharmaceuticals cluster. Okay, so you can see from the maps here. So these are actually for an analysis piece that we did on Cyber Ireland, on some of the membership in the Southwest. So the local map on the top left looks at the Southwest as its area. From a national perspective, you can see the huge highway of links that connect Cork and Dublin. From a European perspective, you can see how the companies that were interviewed have strong connections all across Europe. And internationally, then you can see a lot of material, I suppose, a lot of links and relationships forged with the US and Asian markets as well. So I'll explain to you now, I suppose, the process behind how we develop those graphics and what's included in there. So what is a V-LINC analysis and how does it work? So we have a methodology that we've developed where we go out to interview individual companies and key personnel within those individual companies who would understand the relationships and links that these companies are engaged in. And generally, those interviews tended to be face-to-face, but COVID has changed that, as in everything else. So we can utilize an online meeting for the collection of that data. And what type of data do we collect? So we define the relationships that companies have into 8 different categories. And those would be pertaining to the value chain, which we'll come to later. So the inputs and outputs that companies have. And then 6 sort of support categories. So links that the companies would have with government agencies, with industry associations, with industry peers, which would be companies that they compete with, but that they also collaborate with research and development organizations. So that might be, R&D connections they have with other companies or with specific research centers or universities, specialist service providers. So something that's not within their value chain, but is a specialist service that these companies need to connect into to gain value. And then training connections they'd have with maybe universities or private researchers or consultants, etc. So the next part is we look at the geographic scope. So we set the boundaries for the levels or the areas that we're going to look at. So we define what's local for that particular cluster organization. So in the Cyber Ireland example we had, that local was the Southwest region. National in this particular graphic that you're looking at is for Ireland. European is everything else that's outside Ireland that has a European connection, and then international is the rest of the world. Now, the last and most important thing is that we have a series of Likert scale questions that we put to the interviewee about each of these relationships across the different categories, across the different geographic scopes, which gives us a value that we can place on the links that they're engaged in. So essentially, we come up with a list of their most important connections through their eyes in each of those various different categories. Okay, so each of that process is gone through with each of the individual firms. So how does this work then from a policy perspective? So each of the individual analysis is carried out. So for example, or using a cybersecurity example here, we had one-to-one interviews with key personnel in Forcepoint, Trend Micro, McAfee, and many others in the Southwest. We aggregate all of those firms' data and anonymize it to bring that to a clustering level. Okay, so we bring it up to a Cyber Ireland level where instead of looking at individual firm analysis, we look at 10, 15, or 20 of them together. We then report and build our data visualizations from that point. And then we come up with policies and strategies to help that organization to develop for the betterment of its members. Okay, and that, I suppose, that information gives us these pretty visuals, which help to tell a story. But the real key point behind it is the business impact data, where we understand at now in which particular category and at which geographic scope do the most important links occur for each of these individual companies, but also for the cluster. So in terms of that sort of mapping and analysis piece, we've been doing a lot of research on a number of different sectors, and one of the things maybe where we hadn't been involved is actually the delivery of a cluster organization. So myself and Owen Byrne, who's pictured there on the right in the middle of that picture, put together an application for IDA Ireland, where we came up with the idea of developing Cyber Ireland, an organization that would look after the networking and connections of Ireland's national cybersecurity sector. And IDA were very keen, I suppose, to be involved and play a role in that, because cyber is a key priority area for them from their strategic development. And they see a lot of potential, I suppose, for other companies to come to Ireland to plug into the skills network that we have here and become part of that sector here. So we've been involved in every step of that application. So from writing the application and pitching that to IDA and their board of directors, through the financing of what would be needed and required to put a cluster manager in place to get Cyber Ireland, I suppose, up off the ground and start building trust between members, to the cluster initiation workshops where we brought together industry in Cork, Dublin and Galway to explain to them what the cluster's role would be and how they could input into that strategy. We led the social media development for the cluster. We developed a strategy for the cluster which had the key inputs from companies at those initiation segments. We built the roles and responsibilities for the board of directors for the cluster, and we additionally, I suppose, secured sustainability funding through Enterprise Ireland under the RTCF program for the cluster to continue its journey over the next 3 years. We've also, I suppose, been engaged in the COVID-19 response and how to keep companies engaged and working and pulling in the same direction in the midst of the pandemic when everything is very, very tough in the various different lockdowns that we've been through. So in terms of applying that analysis piece then internationally, we've engaged with a number of different sectors and we've looked at clusters all across the globe. So this is probably the basis of the research has come from engaging with cluster organizations that are operating for many years across the globe, learning from their organizations and bringing that learning back then to help support and drive the development of Cyber Ireland here locally and hopefully input into local, regional and national policy. So we've been engaged with clusters in agri-food, beef, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, cybersecurity, finance, ICT, maritime, tourism, and mining. And I'm going to give you some examples of those as we move through the presentation. So in terms of if we move into the next element, I suppose one way to showcase more about the value chains that the clusters have and how they're connected, I suppose, locally, nationally, and internationally, is to look at how the method observes the value chain and how we can build policies to support that as well. So in terms of the value chain, I mentioned earlier when I showcased this diagram, the value chain is really the inputs and outputs, I suppose, that the company has. The specialist services would be part of that sort of input process and those outputs. But it's probably easier to give an example of an analysis that we've done previously and talk through the value chain from that perspective. So previously we'd looked at the biopharma cluster or sector in Cork, I guess, to try to understand the links and connections that these companies have and see, was there a way, when this sector is hugely important to Cork and the Southwest, is a cluster organization something that would help this cluster to transform further, and what would be the benefits that it could help it with? So in essence, we looked at the pure play biopharma providers, and we looked at the large multinational companies that were engaged there. We had the backup of Michael Porter's work and the development of location quotients to show that in Cork there was more of a concentration than anywhere else in the rest of the country, that this is where biopharma is housed, and we undertook a ridiculous amount of number of face-to-face interviews with key staff across these different organizations. So when you interview an SME or a small company, generally there's one or two people who will understand all of the relationships and the data that you're looking for. In some of these large companies, we probably went over the top and interviewed many managers that were responsible for each of the different areas within our analysis piece. So in terms of what the V-LINC maps look like for that particular sector, so the companies were all based, around Ringaskiddy and close to the water, or further west in Cork. We have that strong highway of connections back from those companies up to central government, I suppose, in Dublin. but you have a connection, I suppose, with Western Europe, but not as much as we saw in the Cyber Ireland maps previously with Eastern Europe. And again, a lot of these companies are predominantly American FDI, so we see strong connections back to the East and West Coast, and then links to Asia as well. But just to showcase, I suppose, how some of the data is developed and collected and showcased as part of the V-LINC reports, this table showcases the various different geographic scopes and the categories at which those linkages occur. So for example, it's reasonable to see, you have government agencies operating locally and nationally that these companies are heavily connected to, okay? If we look at outputs, and again, we'll talk in more detail about those. If we move forward then and focus really, I suppose, on the same table, but look at it from the value chain perspective, there's a number of messages that can be gleaned. So in terms of the outputs for this particular cluster, you see that the majority of those are European and international. Okay, so these companies produce in Ireland for the European and international market, and all of their customers predominantly are based in these territories. Okay, from an inputs perspective, over 50% of I suppose the suppliers that these companies have, that's material that needs to be brought into the and then in terms of the specialist service, this is something that's quite different, that you don't get from the economic data, because you have companies here that are providing these large multinationals with specialist services like clean room technology, automation, validation, cybersecurity, etc. And it's great to see, I suppose, that a lot of that specialist service is bought locally in the region, in Cork and the Southwest, and then nationally as well. So it's great to see that those indigenous suppliers are heavily connected to this sector. So this table then just showcases, I suppose, the overall business impact of linkages that occur at each various different geographic scope. So not to harp on this for too long, but in terms of the local, national, European, and international, this is telling us that the companies they believe the international linkages are of most importance to them. Okay, that's what the data is suggesting to us, that there's more of these international linkages from a percentage perspective that are in the high and medium band than at other geographic scopes. So it can tell us and give us real data about where the strongest connections for the sector is at that point in time. Okay, the other thing that's pleasing to come from there is that it showcases for us that the majority of links occur from a local level. So these companies are connected back in with local companies and local suppliers, and it's great to see that type of connection here. But it's also important, I suppose, to recognize that the importance of those European and international customers and various different connections that they have there. So if we look at Porter's 5 forces and we look at what that means for this particular sector, you have input and specialist service linkages, which really are what he talks about in terms of those factor conditions. So the methodology ties back into what Porter's work has presented, and we can understand, I suppose, that there are inputs that are coming, from a strong local and a national perspective that are feeding these companies, and that's great to see. From a demand perspective, if we look at where the demanding customers for these particular products are coming from, it's a different story. It's not a national demand in Ireland for these particular goods that are being produced. It's from a European and international perspective where the customers are that are, dictating, I suppose, the quality of these products, and where they're going to be moved first for resale, then to further elements of the value chain. So 94% of the outputs in this study are external to Ireland, and 100% of those European and international linkages are in that high and medium band, which explains, I suppose, the importance of those particular customers. So one other element which the software can help with is it can identify who are the key connectors within the Cork biopharma sector. So who are the companies and organizations that that keep coming up as reported connections and links for these companies. And in terms of that, we can see that Pharmachem Ireland, UCC, Cork Chamber, the Irish Medicines Board, MTU, IDA and Cork County Council are key connectors for this particular sector. But you can also see how valued they are to the companies as well. So the Irish Medicines Board, which is the government agency and has to be followed by these companies, and there's obviously a set of criteria that they have to work to, are obviously highly valued by them. You can see the strong connection with UCC. You can see the strong connection with IDA as well in terms of connections that the companies have with them, and Cork County Council also. So if we pose the question then, does a biopharma cluster exist in Cork? And we use Porter's diamond to help us to understand that. We can see that, the biopharma units in Cork compete with each other for staff or to develop better processes, but the real competition is on a global scale. Okay, that's where the real competition for them is. The demand conditions are not primarily local, as I explained. They're EU and international. That's where the demanding customers are based. In terms of related and supporting industries, there's a connected local industry. So 41% of those links are local, and they happen then predominantly in the industry peers, in the specialist services, and in the training categories. And we see some reliance on local inputs, and specialist services through those factor conditions. So we have that supportive and facilitative government, and there are strong connections to those, and there are high and medium value connections for the companies. So does a biopharma cluster exist in Cork? The data suggests that no, it doesn't really exist in Cork at present that accords with that Porterian model. The evidence points more in the direction of a national biopharma cluster, given the large numbers of connections that happen there, and the connections in the industry peers, research and development, training and industry association. It's pleasing to see, I suppose, new work published from Debbie on establishing a government program that supports and provides funding to formalise business networks and cluster management organisations across Ireland, which will establish standard quality criteria. And through understanding, I suppose, the scope and business impact of the linkages within this segment, both from Cork and from a national perspective, it's possible that it might be best to build that cluster on the specialised indigenous suppliers that have an extensive role to play within the cluster, but also have a role for those large biopharma companies that are choosing to locate here on the island, and that are such strong employers of the workforce here. In terms of, so as I mentioned, a cluster organisation for the biopharma sector in Ireland. So enhancing that indigenous services supply. So in order to maximise the opportunity of supplying specialist services to Irish-based units of multinationals, provide mentoring and assistance to those indigenous companies to help further grow and secure that market for them, and to use that as a platform then for their own internationalization. And then one of the other pieces, which perhaps I didn't touch on in the last number of slides, is to incentivize that sort of networking and collaboration for research in that Irish biopharma sector. So one of the key or striking things that came out of the analysis was we didn't see any of these B2B research connections. So there's lots of connections between the companies and various different research institutes and universities and IoTs across the country, but there's a massive lack of B2B research connections between these organizations. So just to finalize this piece, just to mention, I suppose MTU is engaged in, or has just launched a PhD intern program where cluster managers from various different organizations could be supported by a cluster intern that would be supervised and supervised at MTU and part of the V-LINC research group, using that consistent validated methodology. So using the methodology that we've showcased in the last number of slides, we would develop then an ecosystem, I suppose, of the academic organizations that might be part of that, or the cluster organizations that would be part of that, plus the students to develop and share knowledge across this particular area. The students and the clusters have an opportunity for huge group learning, work-based learning, and academic learning as part of developing the methodology as part of this tandem or this relationship. The information can be fed directly into the strategy and the initiatives and help to develop the sustainability of the cluster organizations and the organizations who come on board as part of this process. And it's something that we're actively doing at the moment in Belgium and Botswana. So we have a student in Bologna, Connor Hart, who I think might be on the call here this morning, who's looking at the longitudinal development of the BioWin cluster that's been based in that region for the last 3 years. So he's just getting to the end of his PhD, and there's lots of learning that we can bring from, from an Irish policy perspective back from Connor's work in Belgium. We also have Tabona Cooley, who's based in Botswana, and they have a large cluster development program in the country. They're probably, at a similar footing to ourselves in that they have initiatives and different programs that are starting to run over there to help the development of their clusters. And Tabona will be using the methodology that we've showcased here to look at various different clusters across Botswana. So if anyone is interested in that, feel free to reach out to me. My email and contact details will be as part of the slides, and I'll be passing them on to Claudia to share with the audience as well. So in terms of the resilience piece, just to give a quick introduction to that. So resilience is something that's obviously hugely important now, with COVID and what's happened there, and all of, various different sectors across the economy being at full stretch and in difficulty. And it's about how we sort of rebound and respond to those sort of shocks. So I was going to give an example of a piece that we did on a mining sort of sector, I guess, in northern Finland, where this Puusalmi mine in the image below was going to close in September 2019 with a loss of 2,000 people. So we did an analysis piece with a number of small sub-suppliers to that particular mine, and we took them through the V-LINC analysis. So there was 13 companies that we actually interviewed face-to-face in Puusalmi. We came up with a number of different linkages that they were connected to, and we had a reporting system. So Nihak is in the north of Finland. You actually see it here with on the national map. It's probably easier to point out, but it's 3 or 4 counties there. And then Northern Ostrobothnia was the region we looked at, which was all the way up here to Lapland and where Santa is housed. And then nationally, we looked at Finland and then some international linkages. But in terms of what we found was that essentially the majority of business for these sub-suppliers was in Finland, and they had very low numbers of these supporting type linkages that we would see a lot within clusters. And that really limited their ability to get up and out and seek new and different markets. So we did a process where we looked out into the future with them and asked them what customers would they like. So if they could look forward into the future and say in 2 or 3 years' time, what customers would they like to have at that point? And they identified 23 different customers that they would like to have, both nationally within Finland and then internationally into new mining markets, I guess, or more focused mining markets. We then asked them to think of what links they would need to help them to get those customers. So be that from marketing experience, marketing expertise, be it from internationalization expertise or connecting with government agencies to help them to make that transition. And we came up with a number of different recommendations then to help those companies band together and work together collaboratively. And that work is ongoing with partners in the University of Oulu there. But I suppose what I was going to mention was that small project with the University of Oulu transformed then into a larger project that was funded through Interreg Europe, where ourselves and Oulu put together an application to build, I suppose, a framework or an action plan for how do we, if there's a large company with 2,000 to 5,000 employees closing overnight, how do we respond to that as an ecosystem? How do we help those people retrain that have lost their jobs? How do we help them find new jobs, etc.? So that smaller project turned into a 1.57 million ERDF funded Interreg Europe project, where CIT has a budget of around 400,000 as part of that. And if anyone's interested in that piece, I suppose we started that in August 2019, and that quickly changed then with the coronavirus and everything that's impacted there. So instead of looking for individual organizations that might be in trouble or shutting down overnight, we now look at all sectors and how the pandemic has effectively closed certain sectors and opened up others for and open up activities in others that have made them more successful in the time of the pandemic. So we share a number of good practices, with that project. We had our first face-to-face meeting in Manchester, but everything else has been online after that. And we shared good practices for how regions can support programs that help get companies back on their feet as part of the COVID response. We have some nice good practices from Clusterland in Upper Austria, who we're heavily connected with and are great partners. In Italy, we see different clusters and organizations there, and in Spain as well. So there's a number of different good practices that you can access through our website, which is interregeurope.eu/foundation. And you can follow us on Twitter to keep up to date with different pieces, bits and pieces of information from that. But the other thing, if you're bored in the evening and want some more resilience content, a lot of those webinars are recorded, and the slides, etc., are all based in our library, along with newsletters that took a line on the COVID response for those companies. And regional analysis pieces will be going up in the next couple of weeks from each of the regions to understand the challenges that they've come through in the past and the sectors which are struggling in their regions at present. So
brilliant, John.
Apologies for going over time. The resilience piece was more really, I suppose, pointing to the work on that project and connecting people with useful resources there if they're interested in following.
Okay. John, thanks a million. Thank you for this morning. I think it's been really good knowledge sharing session and learning session. Thanks for your sharing all your experience and insights and application of that and what that means for us, the cluster community here, whether we're policymakers or industrialists or chambers. That I think it really is available to us, and thank you for that. Thank you to everybody who attended here today. Our next webinar is Cluster for Policymakers on the 11th of March with James Wilson, and we also have mentoring with Madeleine Smith on the 9th of March if you'd like to avail of a session on measuring and evidencing the value of your cluster. Apologies for what happened in the middle. I will look with regards to John's presentation, and we'll look into that and make sure that that doesn't reoccur at the next session. Thank you to everybody for your time this morning, and we look forward to seeing you soon.